Well, welcome to What the Theory with Joel and Alan. Alan's now part of the show, even though he's like the disembodied voice. He's the big other that is always speaking to us, and everyone knows the big other doesn't exist. So, hi, Alan.
Hi. Episode is brought to you by Cafeteria.
Guys, please sponsor me. I really could use, in this capitalist realm, if you're not making money, this is a labor of love. Not that I love Alan, but it's a labor of love. Today's episode, I'm thinking of doing a series of episodes on Marxist fundamentals. Now, before everyone panics, I'm not trying to make everyone Marxist, although I should. But I've noticed, I think we use the words a lot. Like everyone now is anti-capitalist to some degree, right?
Yeah.
But if you ask them what does capitalism mean, they'll be like, work! I don't want to go to the job. Okay, guys, yeah. So I think that things have gotten into the, social lexicon, but they've been defanged and removed from their analysis. So over the next, 5-6 episodes of this type, it will just be a breakdown of some of the ideas that come from the Marxist tradition, but also sociology. Some of them come from the anarchist tradition. So yeah, I'm going to try and do this. Please give me feedback if you think that it's a little too convoluted, or I'm speaking in terms that I probably need to come back to a more relatable zone in. But this is my first attempt to try and make it concrete. So I wanted to talk today about false consciousness. My father at some point had a portrait of Karl Marx in his house, and I think in the 70s there was a big movement around decolonialization. A lot of people were studying sociology, economics, and the rest were learning from that tradition. So I was around it, but I only thought of him as this is the guy who led to the communist terror, the Red Terror. And then I used to have so many arguments with people discussing how it's just not natural all of us to become one, and you're going to break classless society, you're going to break money, it's just trying to get government to get power. And I think those things are rooted in the way the Soviet Union kind of veered rightward. But I didn't consider the fact that I was getting these sources from the side of the world that is anti that sort of proclamation. And so over the last 5-6 years, I've really gotten back into reading it. And one of the things that I noticed, and why I think it's an important viewpoint, is many people who are found in the Marxist tradition don't go there directly. It's that you start to analyze things, then you reach a conclusion, then someone else who knows says, hey, that's what Marx said. And you're like, no, who's this guy who was writing in the 18th century that got to this thing? And it can seem like he's a sort of supernatural figure, but he's a real human being with real failures and made many mistakes. But the difference was, he was writing at the start of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that was going to become, the new system of running the world. And his idea was that when you're within a system, it's very hard for you to even have the language to talk about what's going on. But if you're at the end of one epoch into another, you're almost seeing the end of a certain social order to another. And as he was viewing that, he sort of spent his life writing about what capital was. And the first book that you might read is the Communist Manifesto. And the beginning of that Communist Manifesto is the history of all existing society, is the history of class struggle. Now, what does that mean? From the beginning of organized civilization, which had agriculture, that had surplus being created, that surplus had to be distributed amongst everyone. But typically, if you look through history, there have always been hierarchies. Whether it is in ancient societies where you had a priest class at the top, and then you had the peasants working, or you go to feudal societies where you had the nobility, the aristocracy at the top. You have, like in England, they had the 4 estates, where the people, the masses, were at the bottom. All through societies, you find that there are different ways in which those hierarchies are maintained and controlled. Now, the question that Marx is asking is, how is it that the person who is at that bottom rung, the person who is at the base of society, is accepting this deal? Because the people at the top tend not to do as much as the people at the bottom, but they enjoy a lot more of the proceeds. And that's where the idea of false consciousness comes in. Now, I've spoken about it before. I think I didn't do a good job. So let me see if I can relate this properly. I'll use an example that Zizek uses. Let's say there's a young man who thinks his dad is a fool. You know about that, Alan? Someone in your house think you're a fool. A young man who thinks his dad is foolish. And in actual fact, his dad could be foolish. He could be like he's squandering resources, he's not a very good father. So the conception he has is technically correct, and he's accurately looking at the situation of his father being a sort of deadbeat. But when they interact, he treats his father as his father. He pays him due respect. He's making sure to honor him. He listens to what he says, even though inside his mind, in his consciousness, he's like, this guy is a bum. Now, most of us think that we change our consciousness and then we act. The problematization that comes from false consciousness is that you, as the child who looks at your father, you think that you're treating your father as a fool. But in actuality, you are treating him as a person worthy of respect, as a person who is, due of all honor. Now, that question of where does your true belief lie? Is it in what you're doing, or is it in what you think? Now, if what you think is allowing for a situation where you're acting in a way that is detrimental to yourself or detrimental to the very content of what it is that you think, that is false consciousness. So false consciousness is you are unaware of what is compelling you. And if you were to be asked, you would probably speak to, oh yeah, no, I'm doing this because of A, B, C, D. And when you analyze the goals of what it is that you're trying to achieve, and the actual outcome of what you do every day, they seem to be disconnected. Now, the disconnection of those opposing social forces in Marxist literature, you'd call it dialectics. Now, it sounds almost like dialogue, but the basic premise of, and why I think Marx is one of the first proper sociologists is, if you look at where science was, sort of determined in different epochs, you look at the world and classify it according to fixed categories. That's a dog, that's a cat, and it's almost like the beginning and end are cut off. And then you have Darwin coming through and saying, no, there is a process of evolution by which everything is connected. Now, that process of change and connection breaks apart the categories that we usually think of. And that's the same thing when you come to ideas of class. The breakdown of social structures is such that there are people who work at the bottom, the people who do not own resources, and the only resource they have is their labor. They sell their labor time in order to get a wage. Then you've got the people at the top who own resources, and by the very fact of owning those resources, they allow access to some people to then be able to grow food on their land, work in their businesses, make them millions of shillings, and they get a portion of that back. Now, that structure is inherently unfair to the people who do the massive work. But anyway, I watched Jeff Bezos going into space, and then when he came back, that little goblin decided to say,
"You guys paid for all this." So
he burnt billions of dollars just shooting himself into space. Moreover, he didn't even really go, he just went like into the atmosphere and came back down. And then he said one of the dumbest things I think any person has ever said. When he said, at some point we can take all our industries and shoot them into space, and that will, save the environment. And the CNN anchor was also there, was like, are you serious? And he was like, of course we can't do it now, we can do it later. And I want you to watch in the clip, when you just look at the astronauts behind him and what they are looking like. Because in their minds they're like, either this man is an idiot, or he thinks we are so stupid that we are going to believe it. But the very fact of what you're looking at, if you're looking at it through the present lens of the current state of consciousness, you're probably saying that, look, Jeff Bezos worked hard, he started a company, and if you do that, you get to enjoy the benefits, you get to reap the rewards, that we live in a meritocracy. And there is something in religion, there's something in our philosophy, there's something in our social cultural text that will say that he deserves to have all of that, and an Amazon employee who's working for him, helping to produce value, efficiency is probably the most important thing, and they have to adjust themselves to the system that he controls. For Jeff Bezos, this system makes a lot of sense. Anyone who's at the top, the system works, so they're going to work to maintain it. For the people in the middle, they're not doing as well as the guy at the top, but in every society there was always a way in which your place was guaranteed. So in a theocratic society, for instance, where God has ordained who does what, if you're born a peasant, you're a peasant. If you're born into the priest class, you're the priest class. That God has an order for everything, and he has maintained it that way. And all through societies, you find that the contradictions of that way of living start to break apart. The church and Martin Luther, you might think that it was just a spiritual movement, but it was at a time where the feudal lords, the princes, were starting to charge people for indulgences, meaning that you could buy your way into heaven. And the taxation that was happening upon people, the exploitation, eventually would become too much to bear. And class consciousness amongst the proletarians only occurs when you start to look at your neighbor and realize that, hey, we are getting the same raw deal here. I can't individually fight this, but together we have common interests that we have to pull together through. Now, every Marxist, every philosopher who has dabbled in it will give you the biggest quote that Marx has, which is, philosophers up until now have only sought to interpret the world, but the point is to change it. So his view was the highly academic people that you would have found in the Middle Ages, Aquinas and Augustine and the rest, were all trying to understand why, how God ordered the universe, in a state of explaining that, okay, this is how the world should be. Why is the world like this? And then say that's the status quo. Later on, when it comes to kings and queens, the king is in that place because God put them there and has a right to look over all of us. So if it's an order from God, who are we to question it? In the present day, it's meritocracy. And I think why we've reached this present day is because of the antagonisms that happened before. The people who have class interests at the very top are fully aware that if the pain at the bottom gets too crazy, it's an unstable structure. You're standing on top. We're talking about the crate challenge. You're standing atop a crate, and if things start to rumble down here, you fall apart. Which is why someone like Keynes in the US, the UK and the US, when they did the, not the Great Reset, but they were able to give government jobs to people. They were able to open up unions. Health insurance was guaranteed for more and more people. It stabilized that unrest that was happening after the Great Depression. Now, over time, you'll start to see those things getting eroded. So like in the US, one of the things I learned about our friend Ronald Reagan is at a certain point, he fired thousands of union workers with the airline industry. And on top of firing them because they were striking, and what they were striking for was they wanted better pay, they wanted to have more hours of rest, considerably, reasonable things. They were saying, look, the industry is making so much money and we're barely able to live, let's get something. Now, he fires all of them and then bans them from getting federal employment ever again. At that point, countries around the world, governments around the world had reached a certain consensus where they knew, look, we have to give the working class something so that they don't come for the real treasure. They don't come for everything that we actually own. Give them a little bit such that they can, move from day to day and have some hopes and aspirations that their children will have a better life. But once government saw that, Reagan was able to do that, Thatcher did in the UK, different movements started happening, so much so that if you're watching this, you're probably not part of a union. You probably haven't thought of being part of a union. You think of yourself as an individual, as a person who, your mind is yours, your name is yours, everything around you is in relation to who you are as an individual, as a being. And I think that's the biggest lesson for me from understanding Marxism. In another episode, I'll talk about the commodity form and the commodity fetish, which I've spoken about before. But to make it plain about the commodity form, to close this down, and why it contributes to false consciousness, is that the idea behind capital was a very revolutionary force. It broke apart old feudal ties. Back in the day, if you were born a knight, that was it. That's where you're going to remain. You had to be part of a guild in order for you to get access to certain resources, and that's that. But helped along by the Black Plague, where millions of people died, those structures fell apart. And so the nobility started to depend a lot on the merchants, because the merchants were the ones who are now bringing in commercial strength. But the merchants at the time didn't have political power. They just had commercial power. But with the weakening of those social ties, they began to make insistence upon, no, we want to have private rights. We want to be able to start corporations. We want to be able to get tax benefits, because they had capital to fund whatever the kings wanted in terms of funding their wars, in terms of funding the state apparatuses that maintain the system. You see a sort of marriage between power of politics and commercial interests. Now, as that has started to grow, it broke apart so many things. It means that, for instance, me, if I had been born 100 years ago, I would be a tea farmer by definition, because my grandfather was a tea farmer. But now, I assume like Alan's kids, for instance, they're not going to get into the family business. They're going to find their own way, and there's a certain narrative that they have to write. Now, if you look at the narrative of a human life right now, it closely mirrors the narrative of a company. You start up getting some resources, you find a way to invest in yourself by getting an education, and then the returns of that education come when you start to amass pools of either social, cultural, or economic capital. But the thing that we don't realize there is that human beings are now serving the system rather than the system serving human beings. And that sounds very woozy, but the truth is, and I think the alarm that is coming from Marxism is that the false consciousness that we have blinds us to the very needs that are before us. It blinds us to the way we're interacting with the system. If you go back to the example of the kid with his father, that kid may hate his dad. Most of us don't love the way things are set up. We will say anti-capitalist things, we will shout. The power of the way things are set up is it doesn't matter what you think individually. You can even go to the movies and get the relaxation of watching the bad guy in the film get destroyed and the evil corporations are defeated. But that's propaganda against you, because it doesn't change the structure of the system. It simply maintains it. It gives you a release, some sort of psychic release. And why I'm going to be doing this series is, if anyone else doesn't take anything else from What the Theory, my hope is to take you on the journey that I myself am on, because I've been a very independent, I do it for myself kind of person, which is a lie, because I didn't create my own language. I didn't determine the social capital I was going to get. There are things that I benefit from, which are my privileges. And I think people hate that word privilege because it sounds like you're saying, oh, this person doesn't have problems. It just means that there is a certain thing you enjoy that someone else might not be able to enjoy. I've not had major issues because of my sex or because of the way I look. And so because I'm not aware of it, I don't see them as impediments to other people getting somewhere. I'll look at them and say, why don't you just work hard? Why don't you just ignoring the social factors that allow for me to be fortunate and to grow? The dream of the Marxists was that once you had people leaving the rural areas and coming into cities, it took a long time for someone in the rural community to understand what the king was doing or to see the disadvantages, because all they saw was everything around them. But if you come here, we put up the thing of, in Kampala, 90% of homes don't have access to the sewer system. Like, you have that in the same city as you have all these hotels, you have Kololo, like we're all living side by side. And the thing was that tension is going to start to increase. You'll start to notice that, like when the essential workers were called out during the pandemic, and I'm laughing because there was genuine, like I know my former colleague, Tony Otoa, he genuinely was like, you know what, we need to encourage these guys, we need to show them that we appreciate, and they did that thing of let's clap at 12, or let's clap at whatever time, which is the worst, most performative nonsense that you could do. Because clapping for someone, what does that mean? You're giving, you're expressing your gratitude without changing the situation that is causing you to have the power to give that gratitude. Like, if we really thought guys were essential, we would pay them more. We would make sure that they have more healthcare. We would, put our resources where they need to be. Instead, we've come up with a sort of social equality, that all of us are equal, we're equally able to get where we need to, and that allows us to live side by side with people that we are exploiting, not necessarily directly, but we are in social systems and in a position where we're in the middle, and we keep looking up and fail to look down. We fail to look down and see what's happening in Congo. We fail to look down in this country, for instance, when the war was happening in northern Uganda. I have to admit, as a kid growing up, I used to hear about it, but I didn't see the connection between the things we're enjoying and what's happening over there. And in this series, I think what I'm trying to equate is that is a false consciousness. It's a failure to understand that you have certain class interests, and more likely than not, if you're watching this, you have more in common with a day laborer, you have more in common with someone who is a skilled artisan than you ever will with a multi-billionaire. The question you have to ask yourself is, how do you make your living? Is it from owning resources, or is it from selling your time and labor? Even if you sell your time and labor and you're doing really well, people like me who are in the professional managerial class, our social capital is closely tied to the super wealthy capitalists. So we think we are capitalists, but in truth, you're closer to the guy at the bottom. And the question will be, if you fell sick, if you lost a limb, if something happened to you, the speed with which you fall back down the class ladder will be incredible. And I think for me, the challenge is, I talk about the proletariat a lot, and we can speak about them in, I guess, condescending terms of, the noble poor and the evil rich. Let's remove those terms. There's evil on all sides, It's just that whatever situation you're in, you're forced to make certain decisions and you're compelled by them. And that compulsion is masked by whatever narrative you have in your head. Now, I think for most of us, we think we'll hustle hard, fight hard, adjust ourselves, and get to the top. That does not work. In fact, it keeps you more and more where you're supposed to be. The ways in which people make multi-millions is you're either born with social capital, you're born with access to cultural capital that allows you to get the other two, or you have economic capital. If I had been born in a different home, I'd probably still be in Fort Portal. I'd probably still be, whatever inherent skills I have, there is just no chance for me to be able to exploit them. There is a connection, a deep connection between the riches that we see in the Western world and where we are now. I read something that stayed with me for a long time in terms of, we're taught that, slavery happened for 400 years, then they stopped. Then all of a sudden we're like, okay, now let's move. But you don't account for 400 years of wealth being extracted and built. And then you say, okay, now we've stopped that phase is done, let's move on. My father was alive when this country was a colony. So I think, it's a bit too simplistic when we say we blame everything on colonialism. But what I've found from reading all these things is they're saying the echoes of those systems still remain. You might unchain somebody, but if their entire life has been in chains, it's going to take them a while to be able to get out of those, because the chains are just as mental as they are physical. So I hope you'll enjoy the rest of this series. It's going to be marked Fundamentals in Marx. The next few are going to be a little bit more technical, but the opening here and the takeaways I wanted was 3 things. Just the history of class society, according to the Marxist view, is there have always been hierarchies. Those hierarchies are determined by our relationship to the means of production. Do you own the land? Are you able to command other people to extract surplus and you take that? Or you're one of the people that has to work and get that surplus and give it off to someone else, and you maintain something to allow you to survive. Through Roman society, through English society, there have been different forms of culture, religion, and all of that maintain it. Meaning that when you live in that system, it's almost difficult for you to even find the language to not understand that this is not normal. And this is why it's usually people who are outside, the people who are dregs, the people who've been the refuse of society are usually the ones who see the real power of the society. You won't learn how powerful capitalism is in Silicon Valley. You'll probably understand that when you go to China and see what it takes to actually make an iPhone, the blood, sweat, and tears of other people. But the good news is that with that information that lies at the bottom class, once you become class conscious, once you understand, you can then start to fight for your interests. And by interest, it doesn't mean that we sing Kumbaya and be best friends. It just means that, guys, we're in this thing together. And if we don't move from class consciousness to class solidarity, the world will remain as it is. And we'll, take comfort ourselves with stories. And I, for one, I'm tired of those stories. Thanks. Alan, any questions, any points?
Question for you.
Yes, sir.
I didn't do history. So very many things I don't know, learn along the way. So I don't know the origins of Marx, but I know when he started, he didn't think Marxism would be a thing.
Yeah.
That just came along.
He even said that I'm not a Marxist.
Yeah, so the question I wanted to ask you, but then in a way you also answered it that what you want people to take away from what the theory.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't know now because you're also on the journey and share your journey with them.
Yeah.
But let's say dualism
Yeah.
will become a thing 20, 40 years from now. Do you have an idea of what that will be, of what your message is and what you're going to advocate for?
I'd say never follow a Mutoro man. Tubatoro man. I don't know. I mean, those isms can become very limiting. I think it's just that it's more dangerous when you are doing well for you to become disconnected from the things that are making you do well. I know, like for me, I don't intimately know how the food comes to my table. I don't know how electricity comes to my house. And that lack of knowledge means I'm very dependent upon people I've never met, on people whose social conditions I barely think about. And when they're hurting, for me to act like there's nothing going on. I mean, remember when the traders were going on strike? You could see how people are like, man, let those guys come back to work. They're going to disorganize where we're going. I'm like, do we know how crucial that segment is to our own lives? And for me, I think that's the danger. You can get wrapped in comfort and forget that that comfort is being provided by the pain of other people. So for me, it's to remain aware of that pain. It's been quoted to death, that David Mpanga quote. We're going to have David Mpanga on the show. Hey, surprise. About unless we develop, I think, a nervous system that feels each other's pain. Well, I think the only way you can get to that point is when we understand that we have to eliminate this injustice all the way. Because if someone is not free over there, if you see what's happening somewhere else, you are in some connected way. The world is so interconnected that you are benefiting from it, but you're only benefiting for now. Eventually, it'll come for you because capital is an unrelating force. It's a parasite. Its whole goal is to accumulate funds. And there's some guys who say, well, capitalism has brought us a lot of wealth. It's a great system. And I'll never disagree with that. It has. The problem is its goal is hoarding. It's amassing. And just like this country was taken over by a revolution of guerrillas, just because that allowed us to take over one regime doesn't mean it's the only system that can keep going. If anything, I think it served its purpose, and now that it's continuing, you have billionaires, you have trillionaires. Like, you can create $1 billion, but one person has it. Like, that can't be a fair system. When you use the logic that already exists now, they'll say, yeah, but meritocracy. This is why I think that Marxist approach, even if you're not a Marxist, is to say you can't use the logic of that system and the results it's getting to say that, oh, well, this is the justification for this thing. Yeah, we're looking at the result and saying the result is messed up. That means there's something wrong in our thinking. Some values have to come above. Yeah, so I guess my point is that profits over people, you can believe it in your mind, but if in your actions you're putting, you think people are more important than profits, but you treat people as less important than profits, the system will continue as is. The system can endure all these YouTube videos, me saying all these things, banking, capitalist. You can even start selling anti-capitalist shirts. But at that point, you're still participating in the logic. You're not breaking it down. And if you want to know things that really cause harm, try and form a union in your workplace. Just try, and you'll see the fangs come down. So that'll be my message. I think we're all in this shit together. We don't have to all like each other, but we have common interests. And having worked in the financial sector a long time, the biggest banks, the biggest organizations all work together. They understand their shared interests. It doesn't even have to be a conspiracy. You just pursue your shared interests. And without us having that awareness, if I think I'm just Joel and you're just Alan, we are fucked. So, happy Saturday. Is there any other question on your part? Cheers.